Okay, let's wrap up American imperialism. I think I can do this in hopefully 3 or 4 minutes. Um, I did skip one slide, so let me go back and do this one. You'll see it in your PowerPoint. But this is the first time before the Roosevelt Corollary that the Monroe Doctrine was modified in any way. And it's called the Olney Corollary or the Olney Declaration. And this was an interpretation developed by a guy named Richard Olney, where he interpreted the Monroe Doctrine to extend beyond just the continental borders of the United States. Roosevelt's going to build on this interpretation. It occurred, or it came about because of a border dispute between the British and Venezuela, and only claimed that the Monroe Doctrine gave the United States authority to mediate border disputes in the Western Hemisphere, that was included as part of the Monroe Doctrine. So by doing so, only extended the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine, which had previously stated merely that the Western Hemisphere was closed to additional European colonization. So that's one thing that first leads to the Roosevelt corollary, the big stick diplomacy. All right, that's going to get us to James Blaine, who was actually Secretary of State during the Garfield administration, but he comes up with an idea called Pan-Americanism. Let me go quickly to this, and this is going to give us a better idea here of James Blaine, and I will email you this link as well. But he is going. Pan-Americanism is essentially the idea that um, America should be interested in Latin America to help prevent them from getting into wars that they don't need to be involved in, either civil wars amongst each other or with other European nations. And secondly, that we needed to be interested in order to cultivate friendly commercial ties, as he says. Uh, but his main idea is not totally different from that of Mahan, that the United States needed to create a Pan-Americanism that is going to increase foreign demand of American goods and create new markets. And so he sees Latin America as an extension of markets that North America and the United States can use to bolster their economy, and that both regions can benefit from a good relationship with each other. So he is going to constantly and tirelessly try to mediate treaties with Latin American nations, and to get more congressional authority to negotiate treaties with Latin American nations. And you can read this more for yourself. But Blaine is going, and his idea of Pan-Americanism is also essential as the U.S. shifts their direction of foreign policy. Okay, now we'll get to the Taft administration. Taft, as we know, was this hand-picked successor of Teddy Roosevelt. And when he comes in, we know that he does a lot of trust busting and that he has trouble getting out of the bathtub. But what about his foreign policy? Well, he institutes what's known as dollar diplomacy. And let me quickly pull this up for you. This is a good little summary of dollar diplomacy. In his final message to Congress, William Howard Taft looked back at the foreign policy followed by the United States during his administration and noted, the diplomacy of the present administration has sought to respond to modern ideas of commercial intercourse. This policy has been characterized as substituting dollars for bullets. It is one that appeals alike to idealistic humanitarian sentiments, to the dictates of sound policy and strategy, and to legitimate commercial aims. Taft's remarks gave formal definition to the term dollar diplomacy, a phrase synonymous with his diplomacy from 1909 to 1913. He doesn't go after things the same way that Teddy Roosevelt does, but he does help to ensure that the United States is economically in power and has an advantage and a good, solid relationship with all of its protectorates and colonies and other nations in Latin America. And then finally, after Teddy Roosevelt, we have Woodrow Wilson, and we have a couple of things that involve Woodrow Wilson. First, we have uh, Wilson's intervention in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution had occurred in 1911, and then Wilson, being elected in 1912, feared that Mexico's weak status would lend itself to forces that were hostile to the United States. After a few naval incidents, Wilson sent in forces to occupy parts of Mexico, and as a result of this intervention, you had a Mexican insurrection against these U.S. forces, led by probably the most famous, Pancho Villa, who attacked U.S. cities along the border in Texas and Arizona in 1916. So sightings of Pancho Villa were everywhere in the border towns of the U.S., and there was a panic that set in on the southwest border. So Wilson then sent in federal troops, which also included the Arizona National Guard, to assist in reestablishing order. And this intervention is going to fuel the fear that Mexico, when World War I hits, that Mexico will go along and join a German alliance that was proposed by the Zimmermann Note. And you'll hear more about the Zimmermann Note later, but this proposed alliance is ultimately what gets the U.S. into World War I, and it is rightly fueled by fires that Mexico was already very unhappy with the U.S. because of Wilson's intervention. Wilson's policy was called foreign policy. Liked to call it moral imperialism or moral diplomacy, and it was designed to influence and control other countries not through force, although he did in Mexico, but through economic pressure. And so he decided that his foreign policy was to support Latin American governments that were democratic or supported the interest of the United States. Now, we already know about Mexico, but does that moral imperialism or diplomacy work? Well, it didn't work again in 1915 when the United States, under Wilson, sent in troops to help occupy Haiti. And the United States landed in Port-au-Prince, the capital there, on the authority of Woodrow Wilson to help safeguard the interest of U.S. corporations there. And a U.S. presence is actually going to remain there until the 1930s. So although Wilson has the idea of moral diplomacy or imperialism, there are a couple of times, specifically in Mexico and in Haiti, where he does send in troops. But for the most part, Wilson's foreign policy has greatly shifted away from Latin America and toward Europe once World War I breaks out in 1914. And then finally, I want to end with a concept or a term you may have heard before called the Banana Wars. The Banana Wars were a series of wars and occupations and police actions and interventions that occurred throughout this period. They're called the Banana Wars because they involve Latin American countries, and it's mostly named that because of their climate and the fact that most of these countries produce a lot of fruit, and this also includes Hawaii and the Philippines. So this period of the Banana Wars, it begins really with the Spanish-American War in 1898, and then the Treaty of Paris, and then all of the other incidents that where the United States is involved in Latin American affairs one way or another through World War I. So, this includes the operations and occupations in Panama, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Mexico, in Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and also Cuba, of course. So this series of conflicts, the Banana Wars, as they call them, don't technically end until World War I, and then even through the 20s there are a few incidents. And so the next major foreign policy is going to be not Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, but rather his nephew FDR's good neighbor policy that he passes in 1934. So that's the next big shift in foreign policy. And we'll learn more about good neighbor policy and FDR in 1934 when we get to the Great Depression. All right, thanks.